Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Standard Chartered robbery of 2016. Take a deep breath. Feel the weight of your body against the bed, the softness of the sheets, the quiet of the room around you. We are traveling far away to the tropical heat of Southeast Asia, to a city-state known for its order, its safety, and its stillness. We are going to Singapore. It is the morning of July 7th, 2016. In Singapore, the morning does not arrive with a chill, but with a heavy, sweet humidity that clings to the skin like a damp silk veil. The sun is already high by 11 in the morning, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. The air smells of rain-washed concrete, and the faint, toasted aroma of kaya toast and coffee wafting from nearby open-air kitchens. We find ourselves in Holland Village, a charming enclave that feels more like a small town than a bustling metropolis. It is a place of low-rise buildings, narrow streets, and a distinct bohemian spirit. On this Thursday morning, the atmosphere is exceptionally calm. The lunch crowd has not yet descended. A few residents are out for a late breakfast, their footsteps echoing softly on the tiles of the walkways. You can hear the distant, muffled hum of the MRT train arriving at the underground station nearby. A rhythmic vibration that pulses through the soles of your feet and then fades into nothingness. The colorful shutters of the shophouses are wide open, and the lush greenery of the surrounding gardens stands still in the windless heat. Everything is as it should be. It is a scene of perfect, unremarkable peace. At the corner of Holland Avenue, the Standard Chartered Bank branch stands as a bastion of modern glass and cool steel. To step inside is to be greeted by a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. The air conditioning is a silent, invisible force, whisking away the equatorial heat and replacing it with a crisp, sterile chill. The floors are polished to a high shine, reflecting the soft glow of the overhead lights. Behind the counters, the tellers move with a practiced, quiet efficiency. There is the gentle rustle of paper, the soft click of computer keys, and the occasional whir of a note-counting machine. It is a symphony of mundane financial life. A young woman, 26 years old, sits at her station. She straightens a stack of forms, her movements rhythmic and calm. She has no reason to expect that the next few minutes will change the rhythm of her life forever. At precisely 11:25 in the morning, the heavy glass doors swing open. A man enters. In a city where most people dress for the sweltering heat in light fabrics and short sleeves, he is a shadow of contrast. He wears a gray hoodie, the fabric looking heavy and out of place. A black baseball cap is pulled low over his brow, casting a deep shadow over his eyes. On his shoulder hangs a simple sling bag. He does not look like a threat. He looks like a tourist who is perhaps a bit too sensitive to the sun. He moves slowly, almost lazily, across the polished floor. His sneakers make no sound on the tile. He does not look around. He does not hesitate. He simply walks toward the counter where the young teller is waiting, his hands tucked away, his presence a silent ripple in the quiet morning air. As he approaches the counter, a subtle tension begins to coil in the space between them. The teller looks up, offering a professional smile, her eyes meeting the brim of his cap. The man reaches into his bag. There is no sudden movement, no shouting, no display of a weapon. Instead, he pulls out a small, folded piece of paper. He places it on the counter and slides it toward her with a slow, steady hand. His right hand remains inside the bag, the fabric tensing as if he is gripping something hidden within. The teller looks down at the note. In neat, handwritten letters, the message is clear. It tells her that this is a robbery. It tells her that he has a gun in his bag. It tells her exactly what he wants. Money, but only in large denominations. No $2 bills, no $5 bills, just the heavy notes. And above all, it tells her to stay silent. The world seems to shrink down to that single slip of paper. The hum of the air conditioner feels louder now, a roaring vacuum in the sudden vacuum of the bank. The teller feels her heart begin to race, a frantic drumming against her ribs, but she remains outwardly still. She looks at the man's hand, still concealed in the bag, and the fear becomes a cold weight in her stomach. Outside, the sun continues to bake the streets of Holland Village. People continue to sip their coffee, unaware that inside this glass building, a silent heist is unfolding. The man says nothing. He simply waits. There is a strange, hypnotic quality to the silence. He is a ghost in the machine of the city, and in this moment, he has stopped time itself. The teller reaches for the cash drawer, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she begins to fulfill the demands of the man in the gray hoodie. The world seems to shrink down to that single slip of paper. The hum of the air conditioner feels louder now, a roaring vacuum in the sudden stillness of the Holland Village branch. It is a humid Thursday, the 7th of July, 2016, and the morning sun is already baking the pavement of Holland Avenue outside. But inside, the air is brittle and cold. The piece of paper sits on the polished counter, a mundane object that has suddenly become the heaviest thing in the room. It is small, unassuming, perhaps torn from a notebook or a scrap found in a pocket, yet it carries a weight that seems to bend the light around it. The teller, a woman named Jeanette, whose day had begun with the routine clacking of keys and the soft rustle of bank statements, finds her gaze locked onto those handwritten words. They are not elegant. They are the hurried, jagged marks of a man who knows that every second is a thin thread stretched to its breaking point. The man standing across from her does not look like a character from a film. He is not wearing a mask or brandishing a firearm with theatrical menace. He is dressed simply, a sweater and a black cap pulled low, looking for all the world like any other traveler seeking refuge from the midday heat. His presence is a quiet shadow in the brightly lit bank. He had walked in at roughly 11 o'clock in the morning, blending seamlessly into the flow of the neighborhood. Now, he stands perfectly still, waiting for the paper to do the work for him. The handwriting on the note is stark and demanding. It reads, "This is a robbery. I have a gun in my bag. Give me money. Do not call the police." The mention of a weapon, hidden away from view, creates an invisible perimeter of fear. Is there truly a gun tucked inside that bag? Or is it a phantom designed to paralyze the senses? In this moment, the distinction does not matter. The teller's heart beats a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drum in the silence of her own mind. She looks at the bag he mentioned, her imagination filling in the dark shape of steel and the cold potential of a trigger. The protocol for such a moment is clear, yet the reality of it is a thick, syrupy fog. She does not reach for a silent alarm immediately. She does not scream. Instead, she looks back at the man. His face is partially obscured, a study in forced calm. There is a terrifying intimacy in this exchange, a secret shared between two people in a public space, while the rest of the world continues to spin outside the glass doors. The air conditioning continues its monotonous drone, filtering the scent of crisp, new banknotes and the faint, metallic tang of the teller's own adrenaline. She moves her hands, and they feel like they belong to someone else, distant and mechanical, as she prepares to follow the instructions scrawled in ink. She begins to gather the cash, her fingers moving with a practiced grace that belies the trembling deep within her bones. This is the currency of the city-state, colorful and clean, representing the order and safety that Singapore prides itself on. She counts out the notes, the sound of the paper sliding against paper sounding like the fluttering of wings. The total reaches 30,489 Singapore dollars. It is a specific sum, a collection of bills that represents a staggering breach of the peace. To anyone else, it might be a year's salary or a down payment on a dream, but right now, it is simply a weight to be transferred. She places the $30,489 into an envelope, her eyes never straying too far from the man's hands. Every movement is deliberate, every second an eternity. The clock on the wall ticks forward, oblivious to the fact that the history of this quiet branch is being rewritten in ink and fear. The exchange is completed with a ghostly efficiency. No words are spoken. The man takes the envelope of money, his movements fluid and remarkably steady. He does not rush. He does not look over his shoulder with the frantic eyes of a desperate man. There is a chilling composure to his exit. He turns away from the counter, the slip of paper left behind like a discarded skin. As he walks toward the glass doors, the light from Holland Village spills into the lobby, bright and blinding. He pushes through the doors and steps back into the tropical air, the humidity embracing him as he merges with the pedestrians and the commuters. Within seconds, he is just another face in the crowd, a ghost moving through the sunshine. Behind him, the bank remains momentarily trapped in that cold, artificial silence, the teller still standing before the empty space where a robbery had just occurred in the blink of an eye. The aftermath of the man's departure is not an immediate explosion of noise, but a slow, creeping realization. The teller looks down at the counter, at the spot where the note had rested just moments before. It feels as though the air has been sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum where the tension once lived. Outside, the world of Singapore continues its orderly march. Taxis hum along the streets, and the scent of street food begins to waft through the air as the lunch hour approaches. No one on the sidewalk knows that a man with $30,489 in an envelope has just walked past them. He has disappeared into the urban tapestry with the ease of a shadow retreating at noon. But the paper remains. That small, scrawled message is now the most important piece of evidence in the country. It is the starting point of a trail that will lead across borders and through the complexities of international law, beginning with a single, quiet moment in a Holland Village bank. The silence in the Standard Chartered Bank was not a void. It was a heavy, suffocating presence. For a few heartbeats, the air-conditioned cool of the branch felt like it had frozen solid. The young teller, whose world had narrowed to the scrap of paper on her counter, finally moved. Her hand, trembling slightly, reached beneath the polished surface of the desk. With a soft, mechanical click, the silent alarm was activated. It was a signal that did not ring out in the room, but traveled through the wires of Singapore, alerting the authorities that the impossible had happened in the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Holland Village. Outside, the morning of July 7th, 2016, continued as if nothing had changed. The smell of fresh coffee from nearby cafes and the humid scent of the tropical air drifted through the streets. But within moments, the peaceful rhythm was broken. From the distance yielded the growing wail of sirens, a sound that is rarely heard with such urgency in this city-state. The Singapore police force was responding to a call that would soon capture the nation's attention and spark a massive manhunt. As the first squad cars pulled up along Holland Avenue, the blue and red lights flashed against the large glass windows of the bank, casting rhythmic shadows across the floor. Dozens of officers in their crisp, dark uniforms stepped out, moving with a practiced, calm efficiency. They began to pull the bright yellow tape across the entrance, creating a barrier between the shocked onlookers and the crime scene. The bank, once a place of mundane transactions, was now a hollowed-out space of investigation. Inside, the air remained still, smelling of floor wax and the faint, metallic scent of fear. The focus of the initial response turned toward the counter where the encounter had taken place. There, resting on the surface like a discarded receipt, was the note. An officer, wearing blue latex gloves that crinkled in the quiet, leaned in to examine it. It was a humble piece of paper, yet it carried a weight far beyond its physical form. The handwriting was clear, the message direct. It read, "This is a robbery. I have a weapon. Give me money. Do not call the police." Another line, allegedly mentioned, a gun being hidden inside the man's bag. The officers looked at the paper, then at the security monitors, and finally at the shaken teller. As they began their initial sweep of the premises, a realization started to dawn on the first responders. They checked the corners, the staff rooms, and the small, hidden alcoves of the branch, their eyes searching for any sign of a lingering threat. But there was no one. The man in the gray sweater was gone. He had walked out the front door and vanished into the late-morning bustle of the village within 2 minutes of entering. As they reviewed the footage and gathered the first accounts from the witnesses, the most striking detail emerged. Despite the terrifying claim on the note, there had been no weapon visible. The suspect had kept one hand inside a bag, a gesture intended to mimic the presence of a firearm. But as the investigators combed the scene, it became clear that he had likely been entirely unarmed. He had walked into one of the most secure cities in the world, into a high-security financial institution, and walked out with over 30,450 Singapore dollars using nothing more than a pen, a piece of paper, and a cold, calculated bluff. The initial sweep extended outward. Officers moved through the narrow alleyways and checked the trash bins behind the nearby shops, looking for anything the man might have discarded. They were searching for a ghost. The realization that he had acted entirely alone added a layer of mystery to the event. There were no getaway drivers waiting with engines idling, no teams of masked men. It was just one individual, a Canadian national who had successfully navigated the quietest of heists in broad daylight. The streets of Holland Village were full of people, yet he had slipped through the net with ease. As the forensics team arrived, their kits clinking softly, they began the meticulous process of dusting the counter for fingerprints and checking the teller's area for any trace evidence. The atmosphere was one of intense, hushed focus. Every surface was a potential source of truth. The note was carefully placed into an evidence bag, the ink and the paper destined for a laboratory. The realization of the suspect's solitude and his lack of physical hardware did not lessen the gravity of the crime. Instead, it made the breach feel more personal. The first response was over, and the long, international hunt was about to begin. The digital hunt began in a room cooled by a low-humming air conditioner, a stark contrast to the thick, humid heat of the Singapore afternoon outside. Within this quiet sanctuary, investigators leaned into the soft glow of multiple monitors, their faces illuminated by the flickering blue light of high-definition surveillance. They were not looking at physical fingerprints now, but at the digital echoes left behind by a man who thought he could simply walk away. The bank's internal cameras provided the first piece of the puzzle. The timestamp on the screen flickered in small, white characters, marking the moment as 11:25 in the morning. In the frame, the suspect appeared almost mundane. He wore a gray hooded sweater, pulled slightly forward, and a dark baseball cap that cast a deep shadow over his eyes. To any passerby, he was just another visitor to Holland Village, perhaps looking for a quiet place to escape the sun. But the investigators watched the way he moved, with a calculated, purposeful stride that betrayed his internal tension. The forensic team shifted their focus from the bank's interior to the cameras positioned outside, overlooking the bustling stretch of Holland Avenue. This is where the challenge deepened. In a city as vibrant and densely populated as Singapore, a single figure can easily vanish into the sea of people, umbrellas, and passing buses. They began the painstaking process of frame-by-frame analysis, a task that requires a rhythmic, almost meditative patience. They watched the man exit the branch, his hands tucked away, his head still bowed. He didn't run. Running attracts the eye. Instead, he walked with a steady pace, moving toward the shadows of the nearby walkways. The detectives zoomed in, looking for a distinctive mark. The scuff on a shoe, the specific logo on a sleeve, anything that could serve as a visual anchor as they handed his image from one camera network to the next. The digital trail was faint, but it was there, etched into the silicon memory of the street-side sensors. As they tracked him toward the intersection, the footage from a neighboring pharmacy caught him in profile. He was moving toward Holland Avenue, threading through the lunchtime crowd. The investigators noted his direction. He wasn't heading for the train station where the crowds were thickest. He seemed to be aiming for the quieter, more upscale enclave of Chipby Gardens. It was a clever choice, a place where he might blend into the relaxed atmosphere of the local cafes and artisanal bakeries. On the screen, the suspect's image jumped from camera to camera. Each transition was a small victory for the team. They watched as he navigated the crossing, the yellow lines of the pedestrian path vivid against the gray asphalt. The sunlight was bright that day, creating sharp, high-contrast shadows that made it difficult to see facial features, but the silhouette remained unmistakable. He was a hunter who had become the hunted, captured in a series of silent, grainy snapshots. Then, something unusual happened on the screens. As the suspect reached the outskirts of the Holland Village shopping area, he seemed to disappear for a brief window of time, a gap in the digital coverage. The investigators widened their search, pulling feeds from every private security system and public camera in a 2-block radius. When he reappeared on a camera belonging to a small boutique, he looked different. The heavy gray hoodie was gone, replaced by a lighter gray shirt. He had discarded his outer layer, a classic move to confuse anyone following a description of a man in a sweater. This change of clothes suggested a level of planning that chilled the officers. This wasn't a crime of impulse, it was a performance. He was now just a tourist in a t-shirt, walking casually toward a well-known cafe called Baker and Cook. The team watched, mesmerized by his audacity, as he entered the eatery less than 10 minutes after the robbery had occurred. He sat down, a ghost in plain sight, while the city around him began to wake up to the news of the heist. The footage from inside the cafe was remarkably clear. It showed him sitting at a small table, the white earpieces of a music player visible in his ears. He looked like any other young man enjoying a late breakfast. The investigators watched the way he handled his belongings, noting the black sling bag that likely held the $30,000. He spent only a few minutes there, a brief pause to catch his breath and further distance himself from the persona of the bank robber. The forensic officers focused on his hands, his posture, and the way he checked his surroundings without appearing overly anxious. It was a study in artificial calm. When he finally stood up and pushed his chair back, the soft scrape of the wood against the floor was silent on the video, but the investigators could almost hear it in the stillness of the room. He walked out of the cafe and back into the bright midday light, heading toward the edge of Chipby Gardens, where the road narrowed and the traffic thinned. This was the critical juncture. The digital trail led him to a spot where the buildings gave way to the street, and the likelihood of finding a taxi increased. The investigators pivoted their attention to the cameras overlooking the roadside. They were looking for a specific vehicle, a yellow or blue sedan that might have pulled over to pick up a passenger at exactly the right time. They synchronized the timestamps from the cafe's exit with the traffic flow on the main road. Frame by frame, they watched the flow of vehicles: a delivery van, a silver private car, and then a taxi slowing down as it approached the curb. The man stepped forward. The camera caught the moment his hand reached for the door handle. It was a fleeting interaction, lasting only seconds, but it was the most important evidence they had gathered so far. The door clicked shut, and the taxi pulled away, merging back into the stream of traffic heading away from Holland Village. With the taxi in sight, the focus shifted to the license plate. The resolution of the camera at that distance was a struggle, a mosaic of dancing pixels that refused to resolve into clear numbers and letters. The forensic experts used enhancement software, slowly sharpening the edges of the plate until a string of characters began to emerge from the blur. They had a vehicle, and more importantly, they had a direction. The taxi was moving toward the heart of the city, potentially toward the airport or a hotel. The digital net was tightening. Behind the screens, the team felt the weight of the moment. They were no longer just watching a recording of the past. They were beginning to predict the future of his escape. The man in the gray shirt was now a data point in a vast, interconnected system, a signal flashing across the city's infrastructure. Every bridge he crossed and every tunnel he entered was being logged. As the chapter of the street search closed, the investigation moved from the pavements of Holland Village into the high-speed channels of the transit network. The trail was warm now, vibrating with the urgency of a pursuit that had successfully jumped from the physical world to the digital one. The suspect believed he had vanished into the anonymity of a taxi, but he had left behind a map of his movements that was being reconstructed second by second. The forensic team didn't blink as they prepared to follow that yellow car through the maze of Singapore's highways. They knew that, in a world governed by cameras and timestamps, no one truly travels alone. The man who had walked into the bank with a note was now a passenger in a cab, unaware that the quiet room with the humming air conditioner was watching his every turn. The chase was no longer on foot. It was moving through the wires, chasing a ghost that had finally taken a solid, identifiable form. The digital breadcrumbs left behind at the hostel, and the bank had finally coalesced into a single, concrete identity. For days, the authorities had been chasing a ghost, a blur on a screen, a man whose presence in Holland Village seemed almost like a glitch in the city's perfect order. But as the investigators meticulously cross-referenced immigration records with the images from the security cameras, the ghost finally found a name. His name was David James Roach. He was 26 years old, a Canadian national hailing from the rugged, coastal beauty of Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. This was not a career criminal known to the international bureaus, but a young man who had studied engineering in Calgary, a student who had traded the cold winters of the Canadian North for the wandering life of a backpacker. In the quiet rooms of the Investigation Bureau, his passport photo was finally pulled up on the monitors. It showed a face that was hauntingly ordinary, the kind of face you might see in any coffee shop or airport terminal and forget within seconds. This was the man with the Canadian passport, the traveler who had turned a sunny morning in Singapore into a scene of quiet, focused terror. The investigation into his background revealed a timeline that was as methodical as the robbery itself. David James Roach had entered Singapore on the 29th of June, 2016. He arrived at Changi Airport not with a weapon or a grand plan that raised any alarms, but with a social visit pass, the standard documentation for the millions of tourists who flock to the Garden City every year. To the immigration officers at the border, he was just another young traveler looking to experience the vibrant culture and the humid, tropical heat of Southeast Asia. He carried with him the unassuming air of a tourist, a backpack, and a passport stamped with the symbols of his home country. But beneath that veneer of wanderlust, a darker purpose was beginning to take root. He checked into the city not as a guest, but as an observer, someone who was already looking for the cracks in the armor of one of the safest cities on the planet. The humidity of that June afternoon must have been heavy as he stepped out of the terminal, the air thick with the scent of rain and greenery, a stark contrast to the crisp, dry air of the Canadian prairies he had left behind. During his stay, Roach did not hide in the shadows. He stayed in the heart of Chinatown, a bustling district where the past and present of Singapore collide in a mosaic of red lanterns and narrow shophouses. He moved between 3 different hostels, blending into the rotating door of international travelers. In these shared spaces, where the air is often filled with the sound of many languages and the rustle of maps, he was just another face in a bunk bed. The investigators traced his steps to these hostels, finding his DNA in the rooms he had occupied, a biological signature left on the very linens where he had slept while plotting his next move. It was here, amidst the low-cost accommodations and the shared kitchenettes, that the plan for the standard chartered robbery was refined. He wasn't just resting. He was making reconnaissance trips to Holland Village. He was learning the rhythm of the trains, the timing of the traffic lights, and the specific vulnerabilities of the bank branch on Holland Avenue. He was a man who understood engineering, who understood how systems worked, and he was looking for the precise moment to disrupt one. As the police reconstructed his movements from the 5th of July onwards, a pattern of cold, calculated surveillance emerged. He had visited the vicinity of the bank multiple times, lingering in the nearby cafes and walking the perimeter of the Chip B. Gardens area. He studied the pedestrians, the security guards, and the pregnant teller who would eventually become the focus of his demands. He was preparing an escape route that relied on the very speed and efficiency that Singapore is known for. On the morning of July 7th, 2016, he left his hostel in Chinatown at 9 in the morning. He wasn't rushed. He was wearing the clothes he had carefully selected to be easily discarded, a layers of disguise approach that spoke to a mind that had thought through every possible obstacle. The heat was already rising by the time he reached Holland Village, the sun reflecting off the glass facades of the modern buildings. But he remained cool, focused on the envelope in his hand and the note he had written, claiming he possessed a weapon he never actually had. The most chilling discovery for the investigators was just how narrow the window of capture had been. After the robbery at 11:25 in the morning, Roach had moved with a speed that bordered on the supernatural. He didn't flee into the jungle or hide in a basement. Instead, he ducked into the quiet, tree-lined streets of Chip B. Gardens, where he shed his outer layers. He walked into a nearby cafe, a ghost in plain sight, and then hailed a taxi. By 12:12 in the afternoon, barely 47 minutes after he had walked out of the bank with $30,450, he was already heading toward Changi Airport. The taxi ride would have taken him along the smooth, palm-fringed highways that lead to the eastern edge of the island. While the police were still cordoning off the bank and interviewing witnesses, the man they were looking for was already checking his bags and staring at the departure screens. He was no longer a robber in a black cap. He was once again the man with the Canadian passport, a traveler eager to catch his flight. Changi Airport is a cathedral of transit, a place of soft carpets, hushed announcements, and the constant, rhythmic movement of thousands of people. It is designed for comfort and efficiency, but for David James Roach, it was a gateway to freedom. He moved through the terminal with the stolen cash tucked away, his heart likely hammering against his ribs, though his face remained a mask of tourist indifference. He purchased a ticket for an AirAsia flight bound for Bangkok, Thailand. The transaction was seamless. There was no alert on his name yet, no red flag on his passport. To the airline staff, he was just another passenger heading to the land of smiles. He sat in the departure lounge, perhaps listening to the gentle hum of the air conditioning, watching the massive planes dock and depart through the floor-to-ceiling windows. At 2:40 in the afternoon, his flight took to the skies, crossing over the coastline and leaving the jurisdiction of the Singapore police behind. He was gone, vanished into the clouds, long before his identity had even been fully confirmed. Back in the city, the realization hit the task force like a physical blow. The suspect they had finally identified was already thousands of miles away, crossing international borders with the proceeds of his crime. The efficiency of the Singaporean infrastructure, which usually worked to catch criminals, had in this one instance facilitated a flawless escape. David James Roach had exploited the very openness of the city he had targeted. He had used his Canadian passport as a shield and the city's world-class airport as his exit ramp. The trail had gone from a digital spark to a physical pursuit, and now it was stretching across the ocean to Thailand. The man with the Canadian passport had won the first round, leaving the authorities to stare at an empty hostel bed and a flight manifest that confirmed their worst fears. The hunt was no longer confined to the streets of Holland Village. It had become an international chase, a desperate race to find a man who had already proved he knew exactly how to disappear. The wheels of the aircraft left the hot tarmac of Changi Airport at exactly 2:40 in the afternoon. For David James Roach, that moment must have felt like a physical release of pressure. As the plane climbed through the heavy, humid clouds of Singapore, the city below began to shrink into a miniature of itself. The high-rises of the financial district, where he had stood just hours before with a handwritten note and a bag full of stolen cash, were now nothing more than tiny blocks of glass and steel. Inside the cabin, the air was filtered and cool, carrying only the faint scent of coffee and the low, rhythmic hum of the jet engines. He sat among dozens of other travelers, backpackers, business professionals, families on holiday, none of whom could have guessed that the quiet man in their midst was carrying 30,450 Singapore dollars in illicit gains. To the world, he was just another face in seat 23, but in his mind, he was finally crossing the invisible line into freedom. While Roach drifted thousands of feet above the South China Sea, the atmosphere at the Singapore Police Command Center was anything but calm. The investigation had moved with a velocity that would have stunned the man on the plane. Investigators had worked through the heat of the day, meticulously piecing together the digital and physical breadcrumbs he had left behind. They had analyzed security footage from the Holland Village area, tracing a tall, slender figure as he moved with practiced calm away from the bank. But the breakthrough came from the smallest of things: a discarded bank ticket stub and a name: David James Roach. When the name was run through the immigration databases, the digital paper trail turned bright red. He hadn't just left the scene, he had left the country. The realization hit the task force with a chilling weight. They weren't just looking for a suspect in a local neighborhood anymore. They were now engaged in an international pursuit that spanned borders and time zones. As the flight leveled out at 30,000 feet, Roach likely settled into the anonymity of the sky. Imagine the texture of that flight: the sound of the plastic tray tables clicking shut, the soft rustle of the safety cards, and the steady, white noise that drowns out the rest of the world. In his bag, the weight of the cash was more than just physical. It was over 20,000 United States dollars when converted, a fortune meant to fuel a new life or perhaps just a longer escape. He had planned this for days, making reconnaissance trips to the bank since July 5th, ensuring he knew every exit and every possible pitfall. He had moved between 3 different hostels during his stay in Singapore, never staying in one place long enough to leave a deep impression. But he had underestimated the meticulous nature of the city he was leaving. He believed that once the plane's doors sealed shut, he was a ghost. He didn't know that back on the ground. His face was already being transmitted to the Royal Thai Police, and his flight number was being tracked on glowing blue screens in the heart of Singapore. The descent into Bangkok began as the sun started its slow dip toward the horizon. Below the aircraft, the landscape changed from the blue of the sea to the vibrant, tangled green of the Thai countryside, eventually giving way to the sprawling, neon-soaked expanse of the capital. When the plane finally touched down at Suvarnabhumi Airport, the transition was jarring. As the doors opened, the pressurized, sterile air of the cabin was instantly replaced by the thick, tropical heat of Thailand, a humidity that feels like a damp blanket against the skin. Roach walked through the massive, arched glass corridors of the airport, past the towering statues of traditional Thai guardians. He moved through the immigration line, his Canadian passport being stamped by an officer who, at that moment, had no reason to stop him. He was just another tourist arriving in the land of smiles. He walked out of the terminal and into the chaotic energy of the arrivals hall, a place where thousands of stories intersect every single hour. Back in Singapore, the phone lines were burning. The Singapore police force was in immediate coordination with international authorities, including Interpol. Because Singapore and Thailand did not have a formal extradition treaty at the time, the legal maneuverings had to be as precise as the detective work. They issued a blue notice, an international request to locate, identify, or obtain information on a person of interest in a criminal investigation. The wire went out to the Royal Thai Police with an urgent priority. They described the suspect, his flight details, and the staggering amount of cash he was likely carrying. The goal was to freeze his movement before he could vanish into the vast, bustling interior of the country. Every second mattered. While the Singaporean officers were fueled by the adrenaline of the chase, they were also tethered by the limits of their jurisdiction. They could only watch and wait, hoping their Thai counterparts would catch the scent before it went cold in the crowded streets of Bangkok. Roach stepped into a taxi, the door clicking shut against the noise of the airport traffic. He gave the driver the address of a backpacker hostel, a place where he could disappear among the thousands of young travelers who flocked to the city every day. As the taxi sped along the elevated highway toward the city center, the skyline of Bangkok rose up to meet him. A forest of shimmering lights, golden temples, and narrow, winding alleys. The air was filled with the smell of street food, exhaust, and the sweet, heavy scent of jasmine. To Roach, this must have felt like the ultimate sanctuary. A city of 8 million people, a place where a man with a bag of cash can become anyone he wants to be. He checked into his hostel, perhaps finally allowing himself a moment of rest. He had committed the impossible crime in one of the safest cities on Earth, and he had made it out. But as he closed his eyes that night, the net was already beginning to tighten, silent and invisible, across the dark waters of the Gulf. Bangkok in early July is a city defined by a heavy, clinging humidity that settles over the streets like a warm, damp veil. In the Ratchathuri district, the air is thick with the scent of jasmine, exhaust fumes, and the savory steam from roadside stalls. It was into this swirling sensory landscape that David James Roach vanished, or so he thought. He had found his way to the Boxpackers Hostel on Phaya Thai Road, a modern, budget-friendly refuge where travelers from all corners of the globe drift in and out of shared spaces. The hostel offered a kind of anonymity that a grander hotel could not provide. For $16 a night, one could become just another face in a sea of backpacks and guidebooks. Roach had arrived without a reservation, carrying only a single haversack. He appeared remarkably composed, even taking the time to debate with the hostel staff whether he should include the breakfast option for his stay. It was a mundane detail, a quiet moment of normalcy for a man who had, only hours prior, walked out of a bank with a fortune hidden in his bag. While Roach settled into the rhythmic, low-key life of a backpacker, a massive digital net was being cast across the city. The coordination between the authorities in Singapore and the Royal Thai Police was swift and clinical. A small army of over 100 officers was mobilized, tasked with a singular focus, tracing the movements of the man from the Holland Village surveillance tapes. They began at the airport, working backward through a labyrinth of over 400 closed-circuit television cameras. The search was a grueling exercise in patience, watching hours of grainy footage from the Central World Mall and the surrounding transit hubs. Slowly, the grainy image of a white taxi emerged from the static. Investigators tracked the vehicle as it wove through the congested Bangkok traffic, eventually pinpointing the drop-off location near Phaya Thai Road. The trail, which had seemed so cold at the airport, was now glowing with fresh heat. The silence of the investigation was about to break. Inside the hostel, Roach's behavior was a study in restless caution. He did not stay in one place for long, even within the confines of the building. On his first night, he occupied a bed in a 4-person room. By the second night, he had moved to a 6-bed dormitory. By the time Sunday, July 10th, 2016, arrived, he had shifted once more, settling into a 10-bed room filled with the soft sounds of sleeping strangers. There is a peculiar tension in a shared sleeping space, a communal trust that is rarely questioned. As the morning sun climbed over the skyline, filtering through the curtains of the hostel, Roach was surrounded by people who had no idea they were sharing a room with an international fugitive. The air in the dormitory was cool, maintained by the steady, low hum of the air conditioning unit, a sharp contrast to the mounting pressure building just outside the hostel doors. The arrest occurred with a quiet, overwhelming efficiency. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, the Royal Thai police moved into the boxpackers' hostel. They did not arrive with sirens or fanfare. Instead, they moved with the focused intent of those who know their target is within reach. When they entered the 10-bed dormitory, the atmosphere of the room shifted instantly. Roach was found there, amidst the cluttered personal belongings of other travelers. There was no struggle, no dramatic confrontation. In that small, shared space, the high-stakes game of the last 72 hours came to an abrupt halt. The officers took him into custody, the click of the restraints sounding loud against the backdrop of the waking city. As he was led away, the mundane reality of his surroundings, the bunk beds, the cheap lockers, the scattered shoes, served as a stark reminder of how far he had tried to run and how little room he had left. The search of his meager belongings revealed the true nature of his journey. Hidden within his bag was a staggering amount of currency, a physical manifestation of the crime committed in Singapore. The officers discovered roughly 700,000 Thai baht, which amounted to approximately 27,000 Singapore dollars. The notes were crisp, a sea of colorful paper that represented almost the entirety of the stolen funds. Along with the baht, there were smaller amounts of American and Singaporean dollars, the remnants of his rapid transit through international borders. To see such a vast sum of money tucked into a simple backpack in a $16 a night hostel was a jarring sight. It was the weight of his actions, literally and figuratively, captured in bundles of bills that he had carried across the ocean, believing they were his ticket to a new life. Perhaps more telling than the money was a small, inconspicuous notebook found among his things. It was a diary of intent, a window into the mind of a man who had meticulously scripted his own downfall. Within its pages, investigators found the handwritten points he had drafted to guide his behavior after the robbery. One entry, written in a steady hand, urged him to take a taxi and act normal. It was a chillingly practical instruction, a reminder to maintain the mask of a common tourist even as he fled the scene of a heist. On another page, he had listed a series of cities: Singapore, Chiang Mai, and Dubai. Next to these locations, he had written the words "make money" in brackets. It was a roadmap of a projected escape, a plan to continue his flight into the deeper reaches of the globe. The notebook also contained a draft of the very note he had handed to the bank teller. The words, "I have a weapon," staring back at the investigators from the lined paper. As the police cataloged the evidence, the laptop, the clothes, the stolen thousands, the gravity of the situation began to settle over the small room on Phaya Thai Road. The search had taken 54 hours from the moment of the robbery to the moment of the arrest. It was a remarkably short window of time for a man to travel between nations, find a hiding spot, and be found. The textures of the evidence were laid out: the rough paper of the notebook, the smooth plastic of the laptop, and the heavy stacks of currency. These were the anchors that would now hold him to the ground. The dream of Chiang Mai and Dubai had evaporated, replaced by the sterile reality of a detention center. The hostel, once a place of rest and anonymity, had become the stage for the final act of his short-lived freedom. The hunt was over, but the complex legal battle that would span years and continents was only just beginning to stir in the shadows. The iron doors of the Bangkok remand prison do not swing shut with a hollow clang. They close with a heavy, final thud that seems to vibrate through the very soles of your feet. For David James Roach, the transition from the neon-lit streets of the capital to the suffocating confines of the prison was a descent into a reality he likely never envisioned when he walked out of that bank in Singapore. The humidity here is different from the outside world. It is a stagnant, heavy presence, thick with the scent of damp concrete and the unwashed fatigue of thousands of souls. Inside these walls, the ticking of the clock slows to a crawl, and the vibrant life of a backpacker is replaced by the monochromatic routine of a cell. As he was processed, the stolen thousands. The very paper and ink that had promised him a new beginning were now nothing more than evidence bags being tagged by officials who spoke a language he could barely grasp. Singaporean authorities were swift. Almost as soon as the handcuffs clicked into place at the hostel on July 9, 2016, the diplomatic cables began to fly across the South China Sea. The request from the Lion City was clear and urgent. They wanted him back. They wanted him to face the justice of the land he had so brazenly violated. But international law is rarely as swift as a police raid. As Roach sat on the edge of a thin mat in his new home, a complex legal wall was being constructed around him, one made of treaties, or rather, the lack thereof. You see, despite their geographical proximity and deep economic ties, Singapore and Thailand did not share a formal extradition treaty. This meant that the simple act of handing over a fugitive was not a matter of routine, but a delicate, tangled dance of sovereignty and bureaucracy. Imagine the frustration of the investigators in Singapore. They had their man, they knew exactly where he was, and they knew the evidence was waiting. Yet they could not reach him. The Thai Attorney General's office looked at the request and saw a vacuum where a protocol should have been. Without a treaty, the standard pathways for repatriation were blocked. Thailand was not a mere waypoint for the arrest. It was now a fortress protecting the suspect from the very country that sought him. The days began to bleed into weeks, and then months. Roach became a ghost in the system, a Canadian citizen held in a Thai prison for a crime committed in Singapore, while the world outside debated the technicalities of his fate. The silence of the prison nights was broken only by the distant sounds of the city he had hoped to disappear into, a world now tantalizingly out of reach. While the extradition talks stalled, the Thai authorities were not idle. They had their own laws to uphold. When Roach crossed the border, he hadn't just brought a secret, he had brought a significant amount of undeclared currency. By entering the country with more than 20,000 US dollars and failing to declare it, he had inadvertently triggered a whole new set of legal traps. The very money he had stolen now became the weight that anchored him to the Thai justice system. They charged him with money laundering and violating customs regulations. It was a strange irony. The robbery itself, the act of taking the money from the teller, was a crime in Singapore, but here in Bangkok, it was the possession and transport of that same paper that would first see him sentenced. The walls of the Bangkok remand prison grew higher as the legal charges began to stack up, layer by painful layer. In the quiet moments between legal briefings, the atmosphere of the prison must have felt like a physical weight on his chest. The facility is known for its overcrowding, for the relentless heat that radiates from the stone even in the dead of night. For a foreigner like Roach, the isolation was likely profound. He was surrounded by hundreds of others, yet he was entirely alone in his predicament. The news from home and from Singapore would filter in like sunlight through a high, barred window, sporadic and distant. He was a piece on a global chessboard, and for the moment, no one could make a move. The Thai government eventually rejected Singapore's request for extradition, citing that lack of a formal treaty. It was a significant blow to the prosecution, but it also meant that Roach was not going anywhere. He was tucked away, a prisoner of circumstance as much as a prisoner of the law. By the time June of the following year arrived, the legal machinery had finally ground out a decision. Roach was sentenced to 14 months of imprisonment within the Thai system for his currency crimes. It was a reprieve of sorts from the harsher penalties he might have faced in Singapore, but it was also a sentence of waiting. 14 months of listening to the same heavy doors, breathing the same recycled air, and wondering if the Lion City would ever stop its pursuit. As he began his term, the stolen $30,000 remained a ghost in the evidence locker, and the world began to move on from the memory of the man in the gray hoodie. But for the detectives across the water, the case was far from closed. They were simply waiting for the clock to run out, watching the calendar as Roach served his time in the shadow of the Bangkok heat, oblivious to the fact that the most difficult part of his journey was still ahead of him. While David James Roach sat within the high, sun-baked walls of the Bangkok remand prison, the world outside his cell was beginning to hum with a different kind of energy. The initial shock of the robbery in 2016 had transitioned into a slow, methodical chess game played across 3 different time zones. In the humid air of Thailand, Roach was merely an immigration offender, a man who had carried $30,000 across a border without the proper declarations. But to the authorities in Singapore, he was something far more significant. He was a challenge to their reputation for absolute order and security. The silence of the diplomatic cables flying between Bangkok, Singapore, and Ottawa was thick with the weight of national pride. Each nation stood firm on the ground of its own legal philosophy, and at the heart of this standoff was a fundamental question of how a person should be punished for their transgressions. Singaporean officials were relentless. They viewed the brazen daylight robbery of the Standard Chartered Bank as an affront that required a swift and traditional response. For them, justice was not a vague concept, but a precisely calibrated scale. Under their penal code, a robbery of this nature did not just carry a prison sentence. It carried the mandatory requirement of 6 strokes of the cane. This was the point where the gears of international cooperation began to grind and spark. To Singapore, caning was a sovereign right and a proven deterrent. To the rest of the world watching, it was an archaic hurdle that complicated the simple act of returning a fugitive. The Singaporean Ministry of Home Affairs remained steadfast, arguing that their laws must be respected regardless of the perpetrator's passport. They reached out to Thailand, seeking a repatriation that would bypass the complexities of a formal extradition treaty, which, notably, did not exist between the 2 Southeast Asian neighbors. In Ottawa, the Canadian government found itself in a delicate and uncomfortable position. Their citizen had clearly committed a crime, and there was no desire to shield him from the consequences of his actions. However, Canada maintains a strict policy regarding the treatment of its nationals abroad, particularly when it comes to punishments that are not practiced within its own borders. Canadian diplomats began to stir, their offices filled with the soft rustle of case files and the low murmur of legal experts. They were tasked with a difficult mission, ensuring that Roach faced justice while simultaneously advocating against the use of corporal punishment. The Canadian stance was clear. They would not facilitate a transfer that led directly to the rattan cane. This created a secondary layer of tension. It was no longer just about a bank robbery. It was about the clash between Western humanitarian standards and the sovereign legal traditions of a powerful Asian city-state. Let us pause for a moment to consider the nature of the punishment that caused such a profound diplomatic rift. Caning in Singapore is a ritualized, clinical process. It is not a lashing delivered in the heat of anger, but a measured application of force administered by a trained specialist. The cane itself is a long, flexible piece of rattan, soaked in water to prevent it from splitting and to ensure it carries a specific weight. During the procedure, a medical officer is always present to monitor the prisoner's vitals, a strange juxtaposition of care and pain. For nations like Canada and Thailand, the very idea of state-sanctioned physical pain as a legal remedy was a barrier that could not be easily crossed. It was viewed as a violation of the physical integrity of the person, a line that their modern legal systems were designed never to breach. This single detail, the 6 strokes of the cane, became the immovable object in the path of Singapore's irresistible force. Thailand, caught in the middle, had its own sovereignty to protect. The Thai Attorney General's office looked at the request from Singapore and saw a lack of a formal treaty. Without that bridge, they were under no obligation to hand Roach over. They had their own laws to uphold, and they had already sentenced him to 14 months for his financial crimes within their territory. They were not inclined to act as a mere transit point for Singaporean justice, especially when the punishment awaiting the suspect was so controversial on the international stage. The Thai officials processed the requests with a deliberate slowness, perhaps hoping the diplomatic storm would lose its strength over time. They rejected the initial calls for his immediate return to Singapore, insisting that he serve every day of his Thai sentence first. The message was subtle but clear. Thailand would not be hurried, and they would not be pressured into a decision that compromised their legal autonomy. So the standoff continued through 2017, a year defined by closed-door meetings and carefully worded memos. In the quiet corridors of power, officials from 3 nations debated the fate of a 28-year-old man who had walked into a bank with a piece of paper and walked out with a bag of cash. The robbery itself was simple, but the aftermath had become a tangled web of international law. Roach remained in his cell, the slow ceiling fans of the Bangkok prison offering the only relief from the oppressive heat. He was a man caught between 3 worlds: the home he had left in Canada, the crime he had committed in Singapore, and the prison that held him in Thailand. The diplomatic machinery continued to turn, slowly and ponderously, as each nation waited for the other to blink, all while the shadow of the rattan cane hung over every conversation, a silent reminder of the high stakes involved in this question of sovereignty. The seasons in London do not turn with the same intensity as the monsoons of Southeast Asia. Instead, they bleed into one another with a persistent, damp chill that settles into the bones. As 2017 drifted into 2018, the man at the center of this international storm found himself traded from one cell to another. On January 11th, 2018, the humid air of Bangkok was replaced by the biting wind of Heathrow. David James Roach had served his time in Thailand, 14 months for the crime of bringing stolen cash across their borders, but freedom was a mirage. As he stepped off that plane, expecting a transit toward his home in Canada, the cold hand of the law reached out once more. British authorities, acting on a request from Singapore, were waiting. The chase that had begun on a sunny morning in Holland Village had not ended. It had simply moved to a different hemisphere, settling into the gray stone corridors of the British legal system. For the next 2 years, the case slowed to a crawl. The frantic energy of the initial robbery and the high-speed escape were replaced by the rustle of thick legal briefs and the hushed tones of high court debates. Imagine the weight of those months for the investigators back in Singapore. They had the evidence, they had the identification, and now they had the man in custody, yet he remained thousands of miles away, shielded by a complex web of international human rights laws. The courtroom in London became a theater of ethics. The central question was no longer whether the robbery had happened. The security footage and the discarded notes had answered that long ago. But rather, what kind of justice awaited Roach if he were to return? The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into years, as lawyers argued over the soul of the law itself. At the heart of the stalemate was a single, visceral detail: the cane. Under Singaporean law, bank robbery carries a mandatory sentence of corporal punishment. In the United Kingdom, however, the prospect of sending a person to a jurisdiction where they might face the stroke of a cane is a fundamental barrier to extradition. It was a clash of cultures and legal philosophies that seemed insurmountable. The British judges looked at the rattan cane as a relic that triggered their human rights protections, while the Singaporean authorities saw it as a necessary pillar of their remarkably low crime rate. This wasn't just about $30,000 anymore. It was about the sovereignty of 2 nations and their differing views on the limits of punishment. The air in those London hearing rooms must have felt stagnant, thick with the tension of an immovable object meeting an irresistible force. As 2019 drew to a close, a rare and quiet shift occurred. Behind the scenes, the Singaporean Ministry of Home Affairs and the Attorney General's chambers were engaged in a delicate dance of diplomacy. They realized that if they wanted their man, they would have to offer something unprecedented. A formal assurance was drafted, a document that carried the full weight of the Singaporean government. In it, they promised the United Kingdom that if Roach were found guilty, the sentence of caning would not be carried out. It was a profound concession, a moment where the desire for a trial outweighed the strict adherence to traditional sentencing. Imagine the scratch of the pen on that paper, the ink sealing a deal that would finally bridge the gap between London and Singapore. It was a promise that changed everything, turning the key in a lock that had been jammed for nearly 4 years. The long road home finally reached its final stretch in March of 2020. As the rest of the world began to retreat into the shadows of a global pandemic, a small group of officers was preparing for a very different journey. On March 17, 2020, almost 4 years to the day after he had walked into the Standard Chartered branch, David James Roach was led onto a flight bound for the tropics. The flight was long and quiet, crossing continents and time zones, a steady hum in the dark as the plane moved toward the dawn. When the wheels finally touched down at Changi Airport, the heat that greeted him was the same heavy, floral air he had fled in 2016. But this time, there was no taxi waiting to whisk him to the border. There were only the handcuffs, the stern faces of the Singapore police force, and the realization that the escape had finally, truly, come to an end. The journey back was more than just a physical transit. It was the closing of a circle that had spanned 3 countries and thousands of miles. The man who had once thought a simple note and a quick flight could outrun the world's reach was now standing on the very soil where his story began. The legal battles in the United Kingdom had faded into history, replaced by the immediate reality of a Singaporean remand cell. The long road home had been paved with diplomatic tension and human rights debates, but it led, as all roads eventually must, to a courtroom. As the city outside the prison walls grew quiet under the first whispers of the pandemic, the wheels of justice in Singapore began to turn once more, steady and certain, preparing for the final chapter of a crime that the world had not forgotten. The return to Singapore on the 17th of March, 2020, was a homecoming defined by iron and silence. As the aircraft descended toward the shimmering lights of Changi Airport, the world below was beginning to buckle under the weight of a global pandemic. Yet for David James Roach, the crisis of the outside world was secondary to the reckoning that awaited him on the tarmac. He was no longer the anonymous backpacker who had slipped through the borders 4 years prior with a stack of stolen currency. He was now a high-profile prisoner, escorted by officers whose presence served as a physical wall between him and the freedom he had so desperately tried to maintain across 2 continents. The air that greeted him as he stepped off the plane was exactly as he might have remembered it: thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of the tropical sea. But it carried a different weight now. It was the air of a jurisdiction known for its unwavering adherence to the letter of the law. He was taken from the terminal directly into custody, the transition seamless and clinical, marking the end of his long, winding flight from justice. For the next year, the gears of the Singaporean legal system turned with a deliberate, quiet intensity. While the streets of the city were hushed by lockdowns and social distancing, the case against Roach moved toward its inevitable conclusion. By the time July 7, 2021, arrived, exactly 5 years to the day since he had walked into the Standard Chartered Bank in Holland Village, the stage was set in the state courts. The courtroom was a space of sterile marble and polished wood, where the hum of the air conditioning provided a steady, low-frequency backdrop to the rustle of legal briefs. Roach, now 31 years old, stood before the bench, a shadow of the man who had once thought a simple paper note could change his fortune. He looked on as the prosecution detailed the timeline of the robbery, recounting how he had moved $30,450 out of the country, a feat that had triggered a multi-year international pursuit involving Interpol and the highest levels of British and Singaporean diplomacy. When it came time to enter his plea, The room seemed to hold its breath. Roach pleaded guilty to 1 count of robbery and 1 count of removing the benefits of his criminal conduct from the jurisdiction. His defense lawyer spoke of a man struggling with major depressive disorder, suggesting that his mental state had been a contributory factor in the brazen, almost desperate nature of the heist. They described the isolation he felt and the irrationality that had led an educated man to believe he could rob a bank in one of the most monitored cities on Earth and simply disappear. But the prosecution remained firm, emphasizing the daylight nature of the crime and the fear it had instilled in the bank teller, who had been confronted with a note claiming the robber was armed. The court heard how the teller had been left shaken, a silent victim of a crime that had shattered the perceived safety of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sentencing phase brought with it a complex legal puzzle. Under the Penal Code of Singapore, the crime of robbery carries a mandatory minimum of 6 strokes of the cane. This corporal punishment is a hallmark of the city-state's tough stance on crime, intended as a powerful deterrent. However, the very treaty that had allowed Roach to be brought back from London contained a specific binding promise that he would not be subjected to physical caning. This assurance had been the key that unlocked the deadlock with the British authorities, who refused to extradite individuals to countries where they might face corporal or capital punishment. As the judge delivered the sentence, he acknowledged the gravity of the offense, handing down a term of 5 years in prison. But the question of the 6 strokes loomed large. To maintain the integrity of the law while honoring the international agreement, a unique solution was required. The sentence included the strokes as a matter of legal record, but they were to be addressed through the specific mechanisms of the executive branch. In a move that highlighted the delicate balance between domestic law and international diplomacy, the President of Singapore, acting on the advice of the cabinet, eventually exercised her constitutional powers to remit the sentence of caning. While the law often allows for additional prison time to be served in lieu of strokes that cannot be physically administered, such as for those who are medically unfit, the unique nature of the Roach case necessitated a direct remission to fulfill the diplomatic guarantee. Thus, the weight of those 6 strokes, which would have left physical scars, was instead transformed into the weight of time and the finality of the 5-year incarceration. The prison term was backdated to the day of his return in March of 2020, meaning that every hour he had already spent behind bars in Singapore would count toward his ultimate release. There was no restitution made. The stolen money was long gone, spent or lost in the chaotic days of his initial escape through Thailand. As the proceedings drew to a close, the narrative of the Holland village robber finally reached its destination. The man who had once fled into the neon heat of Bangkok and sought refuge in the grey damp of London was now just a number in a Singaporean correctional facility. The justice of the Lion City was served, not through the lash of a cane, but through the steady, unyielding passage of days within 4 walls. The case had tested the boundaries of international law and the patience of investigators across the globe, proving that in the modern age, the world is much smaller than a fugitive might hope. For Roach, the journey was over. The note he had written in 2016 had led him on a 5-year odyssey that ended exactly where it began, in the quiet, orderly streets of a city that never forgets. He would have half a decade to reflect on the choice he made that morning, while the rest of the world moved on, leaving the story of the standard chartered robbery to fade into the annals of local legend. The island of Singapore is a place where the air often feels heavy with humidity and the comfort of absolute order. Crime here is a whisper, not a shout, which made the events of July 7, 2016, all the more jarring. It had been 12 years since a bank had been successfully robbed in the city-state, the last being in 2004. When the news broke that a man had walked into the Standard Chartered branch in Holland Village and walked out with $30,450, It felt as though a tear had appeared in the very fabric of the city's peace. The simplicity of the crime, a note on a piece of paper and no weapon ever found, was a stark contrast to the complex, global machinery of justice that was about to be triggered. For a brief moment, the bustling streets were filled with a rare, electric tension, a collective gasp that such a brazen act could occur in broad daylight. But the robber, David James Roach, did not linger to see the ripple effects of his actions. Within hours, he had slipped through the net and onto a flight to Bangkok, carrying the stolen currency across international borders. The manhunt that followed was a testament to the meticulous, unyielding nature of the Singaporean authorities. They did not just wait. They followed the digital and physical breadcrumbs across the continent with quiet, focused intensity. Just 3 days later, in a modest backpacker's hostel nestled in the chaotic energy of Bangkok, the chase appeared to end. Roach was taken into custody by Thai police, his brief window of freedom closing as quickly as it had opened. Yet the legal road back to Singapore would prove to be far longer and more winding than the flight he had taken to escape. He would serve 14 months in a Thai prison for money laundering before the next phase of his global journey began. The international drama moved from the tropics of Thailand to the gray, damp skies of London. While in transit to Canada, the long arm of the law reached out at Heathrow Airport in January of 2018. For the next 2 years, the case became a chess match of international law and human rights. The United Kingdom refused to hand him over unless Singapore promised to forego the mandatory corporal punishment, specifically the 6 strokes of the cane. It was a clash of legal philosophies, a slow-motion battle of paperwork and diplomatic assurances that kept the case in a state of suspended animation. The files grew thicker, the ink on the warrants aged, but the resolve to see the case through never wavered. Investigators watched from thousands of miles away as the British courts weighed the request, a reminder that in this case, justice moved with the slow, inevitable weight of a glacier. Finally, in March of 2020, the cycle of flight and litigation came to a close. Roach was escorted onto a plane, returning to the very island he had fled nearly 4 years earlier. The world he returned to was different, masked and hushed by a global pandemic, but the justice system remained unchanged in its precision. In July of 2021, exactly 5 years to the day after the robbery, the final sentence was read. 5 years in prison. The 6 strokes of the cane, though part of the official sentence, were ultimately remitted to honor the international agreement made with the British government. The legal saga that had spanned 3 countries and thousands of miles was finally, irrevocably over. The stolen money had long since been accounted for by insurance, but the true cost of the chase had been measured in years of human effort and the tireless pursuit of a single principle. Tonight, if you were to walk through the streets of Holland Village, you would find no traces of that July morning. The Standard Chartered branch remains, its glass doors polished and its atmosphere serene. The nearby cafe, where the robber famously stopped for strawberry cake and sparkling water before his flight, still hums with the sound of clinking spoons and soft conversation. The humidity still hangs in the evening air, and the city continues its tireless, orderly pulse. There is a profound silence now in the police archives where the case files are kept. The dossiers have been bound, the evidence tagged, and the digital records moved to long-term storage. The echoes of the footfalls, the frantic heartbeat of the teller, and the sirens that once pierced the air have all faded into the background radiation of the city's history. The silence has returned to the corner of Holland Avenue, deeper and more permanent than before. There is a strange comfort in the rarity of such events. It reminds us that for every moment of disruption, there are years of quiet stability. The manhunt, though vast and complex, served to reinforce the idea that the shadows in this city are small and short-lived. The case of the Holland Village robber is no longer a headline or a point of debate. It is a closed chapter, a story told in the past tense. The meticulously gathered facts, the handwritten note, the hostel in Bangkok, and the courtrooms in London now rest in the stillness of the past. The city is at peace, the bank is quiet, and the law has had its final word. Everything has returned to its rightful place, and the story has found its end. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.